wonderful to see such a big crowd out here tonight. I know it's miserable and slippery, and this is the season when anybody in their right mind hunkers down and doesn't come out for another 6 weeks. But welcome. Tonight's reader, Sonya Posmentier, is here because of the generosity of the Provost's Office, Africana Studies, the English Department, and of course because of the excellent stewardship of Sue Gage, who's right over there, and without whom nothing at all would happen. None of us would exist. I've known Sonya since, well, if I'm going to maintain the fiction of how young I am, I would have to say for 2 years. But it's maybe 2.5. It's a little bit more than that. Possibly, I'm told 20. And she is the reason why I care about criticism. She is the person who made my MFA program an intellectual program that was engaged with ideas as much as with literature. And that is where I know her from. I knew her initially as a poet. Now she is a professor and a critic at NYU, and she writes about all kinds of wonderful things, some of which she'll talk to you about tonight. Her first project, called Cultivation and Catastrophe, from which she's published 2 articles, is an intervention in the intellectual history of African American writing, which repositions the center of that project from a primarily cosmopolitan project to include rural writing. And her current project, which is called Black Reading, and from which she'll be talking today, looks at the history of Harlem Renaissance criticism and thinks about the lyric and thinks about the way in which Black critics are essential to literary criticism's becoming a discipline. Sonya is the person that I turn to for all kinds of questions. She is my chief pedagogical officer out there in the world. And if you've ever been in my class and had to write, do a 10-minute presentation or have to do a annotated bibliography, you can blame her. But she'll show you a little more of what she has to offer this evening. So please join me in welcoming Sonya Posmentier.
So thank you, Melanie, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Sue, for everything you've done to organize this visit and this week. And also thank you to the English Department and to Africana Studies and the Provost's Office for making this talk come about. So yes, as Melanie told you, I'm going to be talking about some new work. So this is very provisional, and I'm really eager to hear your ideas and questions as this project begins to take shape. And I'm making some connections here between the research that I've been doing and contemporary events that have been unfolding around us over the last year. In November 2015, students at the University of Missouri formed a group called Concerned Student 1950, named for the year their university first admitted African American students, and this is an image, a screenshot of their Twitter page. In response to a series of racist incidents on campus, students' perception of university administrators' failure to address those incidents adequately, and no doubt also informed by the nationwide movement for social justice spurred by the police shooting of Michael Brown in nearby Ferguson, Missouri, Concerned Student 1950 issued a list of demands of their public university. So I just want to mark this also as just a really important and interesting moment in higher education where students are making demands of their own education. A graduate student, Jonathan Butler, embarked on a lengthy hunger strike, and the black players of the Mizzou football team refused to play. So this is the team on strike, which turned out to be quite effective. A day later, the president of the university announced his resignation. In the course of the following month, students at other universities and colleges around the country engaged in parallel struggles for equity and inclusion, also frequently listing their demands of university administrations. To demonstrate solidarity across college campuses, the demands have been collected here. This is the demands.org, and I don't think it's all of the campuses. My campus isn't on here, but it's a lot of them as of December of 2015. The demands themselves, if you take some time to read them, are at times brilliant, at times practical, at times kind of outrageous and outsized and unrealistic, sometimes broad and collective, and other times very specific to particular conditions at each institution. Sometimes very comfortable with the increasingly corporate structure of the university, or other times revolutionary in their outlook on education. But for students of Black history, American history, and the history of higher education, these demands are above all familiar. That is, they echo demands that students have been making since approximately 1968 or 1969, or even earlier. In fact, the Mizzou students of 2015 explicitly acknowledge this repetition with their demand number 3. We demand that the University of Missouri meets the Legion of Black Collegians demands that were presented in 1969 for the betterment of the Black community. In other words, we made these demands a long time ago, right? And they still haven't been met. Students asked in 2015 for an increased commitment to the hiring and retention of more faculty and students of color, for physical space and financial support for Black student groups, and for the production, support, and requirement of special courses and programs focused on Black history and culture. Some of the groups also demanded that their universities consider the relationship between institutions of higher education and other institutions and state instruments of power. So campaigning, for instance, on my campus at NYU to ban the box for criminal history on college applications, or advocating for divestment from prisons, and advocating also for repaired relationships with local communities where there were particularly intense town-gown tensions. While the demands related to administrative restructuring, representation of diversity, community involvement, and campus climate are all worth discussing, I want to dwell today on the students' demands for a different kind of study, a different kind of reading. Because this was a cornerstone of the campus battles of the 1960s, and its repetition suggests to me that there's still some unfinished business in how we organize and historicize what we research, learn, and teach in departments of English, and also in the interdisciplinary study of race. So those exercises that Melanie was mentioned might be my fault that you're doing, might be a little bit unexamined, right? And in some ways I want to examine why we're doing those things and what kinds of histories attend those kinds of activities. Demanding a different kind of education more than anything else on our current students' list echoes the efforts of the 1960s. In Missouri, for example, the 1969 Legion of Black Collegians advocated successfully for the foundation of a Department of Black Studies, a demand and response that echoed and resonated around the country. And I believe that your own Department of Africana Studies was founded around this time, around 1970, by a group of enthusiastic students and faculty who felt that that was important. At City College in New York, where the large demographic percentage of Black and Puerto Rican students sought equal access to higher education, just as Governor Rockefeller's budget cuts threatened the SEEK program, which had made university education possible for many such students. In response to these struggles and what was perceived as the failure of an integrationist approach, these students at City College issued the 5 demands. so that language by now should seem familiar, demands, right? The most important among these was the foundation of a separate department of what was then called Third World Studies or Ethnic Studies. So as reported in a favorable editorial in one City College newspaper, The Campus, in February 1969, this is the description of that demand. The creation of a school of Third World or Ethnic Studies on a par with other schools in the college and with degree-granting status. The school would be open to all college students and would do much to counter the pervasive atmosphere of racism, both institutional and personal, that afflicts America. Less recognized, but excitingly outlined in the prospectus of possible courses published in last week's Observation Post, which is another campus newspaper, is the importance of recognizing and understanding the vitality of non-Western, non-rationalist values, culture, and influence. So what I want to point out about this editorial is that there are at least two goals for curricular reform at City College. One is to instruct all of the students in anti-racism, so as to combat racism more broadly in the country. And I think that's important, right, that these goals go beyond the walls of the college in some way, right? There's a sense of continuity. But also to introduce alternative modes of thought, not only neglected histories and literature, but also different values, culture, and influence, what we call epistemologies, right, or ways of knowing. So the idea that by going into these other materials, we're not only going to be looking at other cultures that have previously been represented in our curricula, but also actually finding new ways to use our minds. These intellectual and social goals were matched, of course, with the goal of creating a public education that would be available to all students. So in City College, New York, this was referred to as open admission, right? And particularly the large population of Black and Latino students who had been historically excluded because of inadequate training at the city public high schools and admissions policies that favored white students. Given the demographic, social, and intellectual matters at stake, students and faculty issued their demands through an embodied response, sitting in and taking over buildings, a social one, providing Harlem community members with special programs during their shutdown of the campus a little bit later in that year, and an intellectual one, creating alternative curricula and reading lists and hashing out the issues through the campus curriculum and the campus publications. I'm spending some time on this historical example of Black and brown students and their professors advocating for curricular reform because most literary historians agree that this moment had a lasting transformative effect on what, how, and why all of us read. In another college newspaper that February of 1969, the writer Tony Cade, who would later become better known as Tony Cade Bambara, who was a professor and mentor to many of the students who were sitting in, explicitly stated this as one of her goals. Even in the midst of the movement, she already identified curricular change as a goal. She wrote at least 90% of the several hundred rebellions that have taken place on the American college campuses were propelled by and revealed a gross dissatisfaction with the curriculum, its premises, its omissions, its presentations, its designers. She encouraged students to take control of their own educations and proposed a curriculum in English departments that would counter the deeply entrenched notion that Anglo-Saxon literature is the literature. In Cade's and many other accounts then, programs in Black studies, Latino studies, ethnic studies, and third world studies entered predominantly white institutions of higher learning from the outside. By offering courses in American justice and the Afro-American negritude, revolution, and trends in Western thought, and these may be sort of more familiar sounding names to us now, such interdisciplinary programs might overturn the deeply entrenched notions, those are Cade's words, about literature and practices of reading literature that were central to higher education. But what do these protests really have to do with reading, as in what happens when we pick up a book? What happens when we teach reading or make meaning of what we read? These challenges to the university are often credited or blamed, depending on who is telling the story, with changing not only what professors and students read in literature classes, but how we read. From the normative practices known as close reading, a term you might recognize, do you? Close reading from classes, right? Which has to do with the idea that individual texts have coherency and agency, right? And that we can address what they do kind of formally in terms of how they come across to us on the page. So a lot of people think this moment in '69 is when that idea changes to a greater concern with history, biography, theory, or the instability of subjectivity. Even now, scholars adhere to a narrative of the battle for the literary canon that posits Black studies as a challenge from outside to a semi-coherent genealogy of a modern Anglo-American literary criticism centered on practices of textual and especially poetic interpretation. Even critics sympathetic to this revolution sometimes describe it as an attack or a violation of what had been done before. And of course, as I've said, the establishment of Black Studies programs in the 1960s did change literary interpretation, and meant to. But I suspect that it's also the case that interpretive reading practices focusing on the text are rooted in questions about racial being and racial history that had already emerged much earlier in the century. So in my research now, I'm trying to discover whether ideas about how we should read literature, and especially poetry, might have had something to do with ideas about how we should read and understand racial differences that were emerging at the beginning of the century. So by looking at an even earlier moment in Black cultural criticism, not 1968, but 1928, I hope to learn more about the connections between Black aesthetic theories and the disciplining of reading poetry. How did certain ideas about how to read become synonymous with what we have now come to expect or imagine will happen when we say we're going to English class? That we'll probably read a novel or a poem or a short story or a play and discuss something about its structure, its form, and its meaning, and perhaps, but not necessarily, its historical and biographical context. And to what extent does that literary history have anything to do with the history of how we perceive or know racial difference, or even how we perceive or know our own race? In the remainder of the talk, I'll focus specifically on the dichotomy between feeling and knowledge that sometimes operates in narratives of these wars between what and how we read. And look at how two very different writers from the early part of the 20th century saw feeling as part of the literary knowledge necessary for reading. And as this is new and sort of speculative work, I'm not going to try to lay out a case for influence between these two writers and say they must have been reading each other and knowing each other. I'm just going to place them side by side in hopes that they'll begin to illuminate each other. So the first of these, you may have heard of her. It's Sonya Hurston. And I'm going to talk about her essay from 1928, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, which was published in a Christian pacifist journal called The World Tomorrow. How many of you have read some Sonya Hurston? Maybe Their Eyes Were Watching God? Okay, good. That's a lot. So she's probably best known for her literary fiction, and in particular, her 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which chronicles the coming of age, for those of you who haven't read it, of a young African-American girl into womanhood, following her through 3 marriages and through the varied geographies of Florida. But Hurston was also a collector of music. She was a playwright. She was the producer and choreographer of a Broadway musical. That's a very little known thing about her. And underlying all of these modes of cultural production, she was also an ethnographer who studied anthropology with Franz Boas, the German-American scholar often referred to as the father of modern anthropology, and I'll talk about him a bit more later. And she traveled throughout the southern US and the Caribbean, collecting stories and songs in Black communities, including in her own hometown of Eatonville, Florida. So what happens if we think of Hurston not only as a fiction writer, not only as an anthropologist,
anthropologist, but also as what we would now call a cultural critic. Someone who not only produced culture, but also left us with vital lessons about how to understand, experience, and study it. I emphasize Hurston's varied modes of research and expression because it reminds us that Black studies was interdisciplinary, long before it became what Roderick Ferguson has called an interdiscipline. That is a field of study institutionalized at universities and colleges with buildings, offices, faculty lines, and student concentrations. And I've also tended to this part of Hurston's work to emphasize the connection between reading racial difference and reading literature and culture. So Hurston's essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, concerns itself with the affective dimension of racial ontology. And what I mean by racial ontology is the state of being one race or another, right? What it means to be or feel or think of oneself or be recognized by others as Black or white or any other race. And yet the ontology of color in Hurston's writing from the start unfolds as a series of negations, and you have this up here. Hurston begins, this is the first sentence of the essay, I am colored, but I offer nothing in the way of extenuating circumstances except the fact that I am the only Negro in the United States whose grandfather on the mother's side was not an Indian chief. Piling negative upon negative, Hurston contravenes sort of humorously, and she's a very funny writer, a conventional myth of origin. Juxtaposed against the essay's title, the opening sentence also is a refusal to provide the gift of affect so often expected of Black writers. She will not join what she calls, again, sort of satirically, the sobbing school of Negrohood, and she will not perform for whites the limited range of Black feeling that swings, as Richard Wright would later quip in his criticism of her, between laughter and tears. So she's refusing to perform a certain kind of emotional role, right, for her readers. And the readers of The World Tomorrow would have been mostly white readers. Hurston's essay thus mostly obviously renounces feeling, or at least refuses to perform a certain kind of bad feeling or sad feeling. Slavery, she writes later in the essay, fails to register depression with me. So How It Feels to Be Colored Me might seem to comment ironically on its own title, suggesting that feeling and color have nothing to do with one another. But after trying so hard to describe being colored or becoming colored in other terms, genetic, genealogical, geographic, class-based, historically based, and coming up with nothing to offer, Hurston keeps falling back on this word feeling. Versions of the word feeling or feels appear 10 times in this very short essay. 9 of them after she said slavery fails to register depression with me, so in the second half of the essay. So why does Hurston hold on to feeling as opposed to, say, knowing, tasting, touching, hearing, or seeing as the mode through which to rehearse the idea of a racial self? What I want to suggest is that for Hurston, feeling is itself a way of knowing, and a way of knowing particularly associated with encountering and interpreting art. In a particularly striking scene in the essay, Hurston describes herself sitting in the New World Cabaret with a single white friend, surrounded by a mostly Black clientele, listening to jazz. In a flight of playful, and she says that she feels her color in this moment. In a flight of playful, imaginative fancy, she describes her own reaction to the music in lush, primitivist terms that often troubled Hurston scholars. She says things like, I am in the jungle and living in the jungle way. But then she notices her friend's banal response. I don't have a slide of this. She says, I creep back slowly to the veneer we call civilization with the last tone and find the white friend sitting motionless in his seat, smoking calmly. Good music they have here, he remarks, drumming the table with his fingertips. Music? The great blobs of purple emotion have not touched him. He has only heard what I felt. Now, in this somewhat tongue-in-cheek account of racial difference, it is the white man's failure of feeling, not her failure to register depression, that is insufficient. It's a failure to read and interpret art. By contrast, Hurston's feeling emerges as a superior form of artistic interpretation. We might view Hurston's adherence to feeling as an early iteration of the division between feeling and rationality that the Black poet Audre Lorde, would later claim as one basis of a Black feminist way of thinking. Lorde wrote, "The white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. The Black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free." But there's a little bit of a problem with this, because Hurston was very busy with what the white fathers told us. I mentioned before her mentor, Franz Boas, the father of modern anthropology, whom she actually called Papa Franz. And she praised him for his genius for pure objectivity. She emulated to some extent his inductive strategies of observation in the field. And together they used the very tools of scientific empiricism to disprove the tenets of race science. Indeed, to establish that the study of culture could be what we can now call cultural. In other words, the idea that race isn't biological but culturally formed, which is something I think we now almost take for granted, right? That idea kind of emerged in this period. So for example, Hurston and Boas and Melville Herskovitz, another important anthropologist, were out on the streets of Harlem measuring people's heads during this period, but not to prove racial difference, but rather to disprove the biological basis of race, right? So they were using the tools of race science to disprove race science. So what if Hurston's training as an anthropologist, at the very moment that the discipline is undergoing this radical transformation from a physical science, from biology, basically, to a social science, and her description of racial selves and racial belonging as perceptible through feeling are in fact part and parcel of one another? What are the implications of this kind of connection for the study of literature? So for the moment, I'm actually just going to leave this question hanging and raise a different one, which is whether Hurston's simultaneous rejection of and embrace of feeling has any parallel in simultaneous conversations about poetic feeling. So I'm going to turn very briefly to a very different scholar. Other scholars formulating theories of reading during this period in their attempts to describe the scale, quality, and duration of reading practices struggle to determine whether reading constitutes a scientific practice of observation. One of these was the British critic I.A. Richards, whose 1929 work, Practical Criticism, was one basis for the practice we now call close reading. So this guy's one of the reasons that when you come to English class, your professors might say, but what do you see on the page? Where do you see that in the text? Can you show me the evidence? Okay, so don't blame me, blame I.A. Richards. According to many scholars, the school of literary criticism, often referred to as the New Critics, subsumed matters of race, culture, ethics, history, and politics to the matter of the text itself. I'm skipping. And the experimental rubric of I.A. Richards' practical criticism would seem to be a foundational example of the strategies of depoliticization that people often say accompanied close reading. Richards was a British professor and critic, but he also taught in the US for many years. And the thing that he did is he famously stripped the authorship and contextual information from 13 poems and gave them to his students and asked them to write about the poems without any of that information, and then wrote a book about all the ways in which they were wrong about the poems and how do we need to teach poetry differently so that this won't happen again. And he called it the record of a piece of field work in comparative ideology. So he performed a kind of experiment on his students to test readers' response to poetry out of its context. And this in and of itself, I think, suggests the comparison to Hurston, the way that they both thought of their work as a kind of field work. Looking at Richard's efforts to describe the function of feeling in poetry might provide a further opening between these two lineages, usually understood as distinct. Like Hurston's non-description of how it feels to be colored me, Richards' theory of literary interpretation attempts simultaneously to legitimate itself in relationship to and distinguishing itself from scientific and social scientific methods. Richards takes feeling to be one of the four aspects of nearly all articulate speech with which we must reckon when considering how to read and understand poetry, along with sense, tone, and intention. And he says that understanding feeling is one of the primary tasks of the reader and critic. But he also says that conveying and interpreting feeling is especially difficult. We don't have very good tools to do it. We lack a method and technique. And this is why so many of the undergraduates messed up when they were looking at the poems. In his view, literary analysis can result in misunderstandings, both of sense and feeling. So he wants to find another way for us to understand it, and he says that it's actually in poetry that we already have those methods. The compression, here's the quotation you have up here, the compression of poetic language tends to obstruct the discursive intelligence that works by spreading ideas out and separating their parts. But this very concentration may assist immediate, instantaneous apprehension. Nowhere but in poetry, unless in mathematics, do we meet with ideas so closely packed together, so tightly woven. In other words, poetry especially has the capacity to communicate feeling through metaphor and possesses the technical gifts, almost scientific or mathematical, that Richards seeks for criticism. So even as Richards wants to distinguish the more logical work of determining sense from poetry from the more subjective work of perceiving feeling, he also insists that perceiving feeling can be taught or systemized through these protocols. And he believes this can be done through teaching poetry in relationship to behavioral psychology. I'm not even going to try to explain this crazy diagram to you, but this is like what happens when literature professors try to do neuroscience. And this is feeling over here, number 5. Okay, but this is how the last line of a poem by Robert Browning produces feeling and emotion and sense and reference for you, okay? So, what?
It seems very clear.
I mean, really, maybe you should come up here. I've been looking at this a lot, and I can't quite work it out. But the idea here is that neuroscience, the way the brain works, is actually going to be the key. And the other new critics really try to distance themselves from this and say poetry isn't a science. But I'm interested in the idea that this still is kind of underlying this really fundamental text that we think of as just all about reading what's on the page, what's on the page, what's on the page, right? And I think it's also important to say that as part of this experiment, Richards was interested in not only the idea that students would learn to perceive the feeling of the poems, but that the poems would also produce certain kinds of feelings in the students, right? And produce in the students better understandings of their own feelings. So that there was a kind of therapeutic process at work here. As John Guillory and Joshua Gang and other scholars have recently demonstrated, to uncover the psychological and thus the scientific roots of close reading as a technique is to challenge some of our assumptions about close reading as this kind of isolated disciplinary practice that sets itself apart from the sciences and social sciences. In other words, the most significant theory of literary interpretation in US classrooms derives from the discipline's attempt simultaneously to legitimate itself in relationship to and distinguish itself from scientific methods. Just at the moment when behavioral psychology itself is trying to distance itself from the more social study of human behavior known as psychoanalysis, right? So behavioral psychology is saying we're a hard science, not a mushy social science, right? And then at the same time, literature is trying to claim this. So by bringing together psychology and literary analysis, Richards wants to claim for literary criticism a technical rigor. As he puts it, quote, something parallel to the recent advances in physics achieved through geology, because now you could get these abstract laws from rocks. But he was always haunted, I think, by the social, too, or the human. So if both the architects of what we now call close reading and Hurston, an early theorist of Black aesthetics, recognized the necessity and the slipperiness of accounting for feeling, they did so while evoking the specter of empirical or scientific knowledge. So I want to suggest that these two aesthetic philosophies of feeling are linked by their investment in method, technique, and experiment, that is, by a vexed scientific logic that is at once part of, and the other two, literary interpretation. By positing Hurston as not only a theorist of racial identity, but also a theorist of critical reading practice, I mean to suggest that the suppressed interdisciplinarity of close reading, in other words, this scientific or social scientific background that we kind of pretend isn't there, might unsettle the oft-supposed extradisciplinarity of Blackness to literary study. In conclusion, I'm just going to turn briefly to the most famous passage in Hurston's essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, in which she describes racial feeling as that which is produced by contrast. I do not always feel colored. I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. For instance, at Barnard, beside the waters of the Hudson, I feel my race. Among the 1,000 white persons, I am a dark rock surged upon, overswept by a creamy sea. I am surged upon and overswept, but through it all, I remain myself. When covered by the waters, I am, and the ebb but reveals me again. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Oh, that's heartbreaking. I'll have to just describe it to you. As the contemporary painter Glenn Ligon has shown us, is the thick oil sticks, black on white, or maybe white on black, with which he letters Hurston's sentences. I'll just show it to you. The background, so he has a painting in which he uses this word, I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. The writing, the lettering kind of disintegrates. So you can't quite tell whether it's white on black or black on white. The background and foreground are not entirely distinguishable in Hurston's racial theory. The contrast intensifies and mutes and reverses as the fragments, smudges, and remainders of Ligon's oil stick scatter and collect in unexpected places, only partially marking and filling in the canvas. Referring to both Hurston's essay and Ligon's painting, the poet Claudia Rankin. Oh, it's bad. It's fine. Okay, I'm just going to keep a hand on that. She recirculates Hurston's line about contrast in her best-selling 2014 hybrid book of poetry and essays. I'm just curious if any of you have seen it or heard of it? Oh, good. A whole bunch. Good. If you haven't, you should read it. It's so unusual for a book of poetry to be on the New York Times bestseller list. It's just really extraordinary. And the book was also nominated for a National Books Critics Circle Award in both poetry and nonfiction, and won in the poetry category. So that's just really fascinating in and of itself. And Hurston's line is really central to the text. In one of her citations of Hurston, Rankin uses what she calls the appropriated line of Hurston's essay to describe the color line confronted by Venus and Serena Williams in Tense. So here's Rankin. How does a victorious or defeated black woman's body in a historically white space look like? Sorry, what does it look like? Serena and her big sister Venus Williams brought to mind Zora Neale Hurston's "I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background." This appropriated line, stenciled on canvas by John Ligon, who uses plastic letter stencils, smudging oil sticks, and graphite to transform the words into abstractions, seemed to be ad copy for some aspect of life for all Black bodies. In exploring Serena Williams' right to anger, Rankine underscores the right to feeling. It's a big part of this part of the book, in order to alert us to the need for a different type of reading when we approach an American lyric, which is the subtitle of her book and her previous book. That is, the problem of interpretation that line judges encounter in relationship to Serena Williams is not, and to her foot, right, crossing the line, is not unrelated to the problems that other kinds of line judges encounter when they read and interpret American lyrics, judging, for instance, poetry prizes. So too, Rankine's own poetic lines become Black bodies against the sharp white background of the page, here most starkly in the names of Black Americans killed by police violence. This is page 134, and in the original printing it has only the first name, Jordan Russell Davis, and the date of Davis's death, and on the other side it says American Justice. And then, I'm not sure I'm paraphrasing that entirely correctly, and then in the subsequent printings, as you can see, the list of names grows. So this one ends with Sandra Bland, but I think they may go further by now. And of course, no one could have anticipated that there would be this many printings of this book, or this many names. In a sense, Rankine's appropriation of Hurston's color line brings us back to the place we began. Students putting their bodies on the line to demand a different kind of education and a different kind of reading. Here we're back in 1969, inhabiting the university physically, socially, and intellectually. It's perhaps not surprising that Hurston's most famous description of being colored comes from her time in college at Barnard, during the mutual formation, and maybe we won't think about that word the same way post-Beyonce, of her racial and intellectual selves. And I think I'll stop there. Maybe I'll try to pull up the line again.
Professor Posmentier will take questions if you guys have them.
I am going to be a public school teacher. I'm hoping to teach 9th grade. And one of the novels that I would like to teach, at least in part, is Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Great.
And I'm wondering, what, if not a close reading, then what sort of approach would you advocate for when teaching that text?
That's such a great question. I don't want to say that I think close reading is bad. But more so, and I think it's great to teach close reading, because I think that it's useful for students to think about how art and writing is made, in part because they might want to make some, right? And also because other meanings emerge in that process. But what I would do is make sure that there are a lot of different ways of thinking. I mean, what I would hope to do is help you think about the historical background of that way of reading. So for teaching Hurston, one thing that I do when I teach Hurston, and you can use this with other writers too, Hurston has another great essay called Characteristics of Negro Expression that I actually, in the larger project this is part of, I think about that essay in relationship to how it feels to be colored me. In which she lists all these terms that she says are sort of central characteristics of Black art. So one of the things I do with students often is I have them, and some of them are the same terms that are the key critical terms of that have been kind of just absorbed into the university as close reading terms, right? Like words like metaphor and simile, right? And rhythm, right? But Hurston historicizes them differently in relationship to Black art. So I let students look at different definitions of metaphor. I have them look at Hurston's definitions and examples of metaphor and simile, and also M.H. Abrams' definitions of metaphor from down the road at Cornell in the 60s of metaphor and simile, right? And think about which of these definitions do we see operating in this particular book that we're reading? And how is it useful to look at the historical context that Hurston wants to give us? So it's obviously a great way to read Hurston, because she was obviously drawing on a lot of these cultural traditions that she saw, particularly in the folklore that she was collecting. And the other thing that I would say about Hurston is that I think that novel is often taught very much as a story about one person coming of age. It's about Janie and how she comes to be a woman. But I also think it's very much a historical novel. There's the history of the Florida 1928 hurricane that she picks up in that novel. There's the history of migrant labor that brings that community of people together on the mock working when Jeannie and TK go down. Sorry for those of you who haven't read it. But all of that stuff can add a lot of richness to the teaching of that novel. There's recordings of Hurston singing and playing music that she collected from musicians who are also named as characters in the novel, the Bahamian workers in that scene around the hurricane. And that music is readily available on the Library of Congress website. It's really fun for students to listen to Hurston's own voice singing those songs, and it really enriches their reading. Such a great question. I think I saw another hand. Is that, yeah.
Well, I don't have a good question about it, but I was glad you brought up Beyonce at the end of your talk here.
My students, we were just reading this Hurston essay last week, and they were like, we have to talk about the Beyonce video.
Right, the connection isn't obvious, but I think there is place for it in the discussion. So, I don't know, what kind of things what do you think that brings to your talk, Beyonce's new video, and the criticism around it?
A lot. It was so fortuitous for me that it was like this week that I happened to be giving this talk, and I was also just teaching this stuff in my class. But so for me, it is that idea of formation as both. I'm thinking more about the Super Bowl performance. Did everybody see it? Some of you, most of you, people know what I'm talking about. So in the Super Bowl performance, right, Beyonce says, "Ladies, get in formation." And the dancers get in an X, right, as in Malcolm X. And there's also all these allusions to the Black Panthers. And so what my students really picked up on this, but I agree. I think is sort of interesting about that is it's sort of, well, first of all, it's a pun, right? Get information and get in formation, right? But there's also the idea of formation as sort of an artistic form, as a structure, as something that's created, right? And then the idea of formation as the formation of a self and the formation of a racial self, and the way that people are talking about this video in relationship to Beyonce's articulation of her Blackness against another point my students can make is sort of the sharp white background of the Super Bowl itself, right? I think it's that dual meaning of the word formation, or triple meaning, information, formation, racial formation, artistic formation in the Beyonce video. Maybe I'm reading too much, but that for me really resonates with what's happening in Hurston's writing, that her interest in artistic form and what we can make, right? And then in the idea of what makes a racial subject, what makes a subject, period, what makes a person, right, as part of a community, as really interconnected for Hurston. So, I mean, I think there are all these other questions about that video, about capitalism, and about labor, and about, commodity. There's lots of questions about the hurricane, but there's a lot of different stuff going on there. Another thing my students really picked up on just about that video is also that, the sort of celebration of, and this is more in relationship to some of my other work, but the celebration of Southern Blackness and Southern identity as part of what it means to be a modern American subject, right? Something that often gets lost in a lot of our conversations, and I think that's something that was also really, really important for Hurston as a writer. So another kind of connection.
So I'm still trying to formulate my question, so it might just be a talk at this kind of question. But it also, I was thinking about the Beyonce video in relationship to the Claudia Rankin book, which I love. But a lot of people were, I remember there was a Saturday Night Live sketch about the Beyonce video where everyone's like, oh my God, Beyonce's black. This is a video, it's not for us, and things usually are. But like the white people, it's this big kind of traumatic thing. So I'm thinking about audience in relationship to video, and also like people have criticized Claudia Rankin about saying that it's created for more for a white audience or speaks to a white audience. And I'm wondering how that concept of audience fits into the stark white background idea.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's such a big question. I mean, in terms of ranking, I mean, I don't think she wrote that book for white. I mean, I'm just really skeptical that it speaks. I mean, I think what's fascinating about that book, and again, I think some of you had read it or are familiar with it, is that she's a very difficult writer. I mean, just the fact that it's poems and essays, and you don't really know what it is. In 1 minute she's talking about tennis, and the next minute it's a poem, and and there's images, and it's just not what we expect a poetry book to be. And so there's all this different kinds of work we have to do to approach it. We were talking earlier about Kane and Jean Toomer, who's a very similar writer from the period in which Toomer's writing, in which Hurston is writing. So I mean, just one thing I think is interesting about that book is the way it's at once really transparent and available to a lot of different readers in terms of the way it speaks to our current political moment, and really difficult. And a book you could maybe sit with and read over and over and over again and get new things out of. And actually, the fact that you could open, I have a couple different copies of it for various reasons, and they're all a little bit different. Right? So even the idea that I might look and see 4 names or see 20 names, right, and have to process the book differently. So for me, I'm not kind of interested in whether she's selling out or not selling out, because I think she speaks differently to different audiences, right? And so, I mean, I guess reading backwards, I think that we could say that about Hurston. And, in her own generation, there was this big argument, right? Like, should we be producing propaganda? Right? Should we, and by propaganda, people in that time meant it's really important that the people who were advocating for black art as propaganda were saying it's really important that we only represent ourselves in the best possible light. And this is also part of the Beyonce flack, right? Like, it's too ratchety. It's not like it's not kind of respectable enough. Right? And so this was something that Hurston was, she kind of got both sides of this. Like, it's too easy, the people in her books are too happy, she's not representing the realities of how difficult life was and the realities of labor, which I think is true in some ways, but not if you really think about everything that's going on when the hurricane hits and their eyes were watching God. But also saying these people are kind of too low down. Right? They're too folksy, and they're not respectable enough, right? So, I mean, I think that that's sort of the version of that kind of question about audience and respectability politics that was sort of circulating in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think that it's really interesting now that people are still wrestling with these same questions. I don't have very good answers, but it's a great question.
I'm not going to word this very well, but you talked a lot, about like poetry and putting it in the context of like its history and the influence of like who the author is and how that's affecting it. But I'm also wondering if you feel like there's a place for poetry to be read, without any of that, without any context of who it's coming from, what it's coming from, just as the words on the page, and does that detract so much from the poem that we're really doing the disservice to not be acknowledging who it's coming from?
That's a good question. No, it's wonderful. I mean, I think like as someone who teaches poetry, I'm totally a both and kind of person. Like I want to use all the methods that we have. My own work is I'm very interested in history. I'm very interested in culture and in biography, and even in like the history of how, like the physical history of books, right? Like where was this published and what were the pages like and what were the, but I'm also like really interested in form, right? And like why did Claude McKay, to name another poet that I love from Hurston and Toomer's generation, why was he writing sonnets? You know, when Ezra Pound was saying, let's break the pentameter, right? And why were all these Black writers, in fact, in the early 20th century writing sonnets? What was that about, right? So I think it's really great to look at how poets are using form in different ways. I have trouble disentangling it all entirely. But I like even just in the classroom sometimes to look at a poem just in terms of what's right in front of us. And then I'm not going to trick my students for a whole semester like I Richards did, but then kind of gradually bring in some of the historical context, right? And see what new things emerge. So I'm kind of both and, yeah. Is that it?
No.
Hi. I have a question that's sort of about the cultural politics, maybe of feeling, because that was a very important part of the talk. And maybe shifting context a little, I did read your piece about the kind of poetry world hubbub in response to the Kenny Goldsmith Vanessa plays, sort of appropriations. And I'm interested in the way in which feeling entered into that debate very, very problematically. In some cases as a way not of engaging, but actually of eliding the politics of the work. So
can you say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel bad now because I feel like I should explain what these...
You can, go for it.
Or you can, or like,
sure.
These conceptual poets who use found texts use these very, very offensive found texts to produce these kind of pseudo-quasi-critical cultural statements about race. So Kenneth Goldsmith, for instance, got a hold of Michael Brown's autopsy and manipulated the autopsy in such a way that it read like a poem, and the poetic manipulation operated in such a way that it emphasized the autopsy's description of Michael Brown's genitals. And he read this at Brown University, and it was very, very offensive to a number of people. And what I mean by feeling is that the sort of response, if not by Kenneth Goldsmith himself, by some of the people who were defending him, was that he should have thought more about this because he hurt people's feelings.
Right.
As if the feelings were the problem, as opposed to the fact that this was an attempt to capitalize on Black murder and Black death in a kind of hipster, ironic way. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
That does make a lot of sense. And I'm really glad you asked this question because I haven't thought about that quite in relationship to this, so it's useful to me. So I think that that's true. I agree with what you're saying, right? That kind of interpretation that the problem is, well, they were kind of insensitive and they hurt people's feelings and they should have thought more about people's feelings is sort of just problematic as a stance or fails to address sort of the central issue. That said, just because you're asking the question, I'm kind of interested in I can't answer it right now, but in kind of thinking more about, well, what happens if we kind of think about feeling in the way that I've been suggesting that we do, which is that feeling is itself a kind of knowledge. So people's hurt feelings are actually an epistemology, right? And they have hurt feelings have a history and have a context and have other texts that they're already connected to, right? And so that they actually have to be taken seriously as criticism of the work or criticism of the statements or whatever, pranks, whatever we want to call them, and not just as like a sort of public relations problem that needs to be managed, right? So I don't know, I would really have to think more about that, but I mean, I think Rankin is already talking about that in her book because she is responding to similar situations. She wrote this book really in response, when you say this, I mean, in response to Tony Hoagland's poem, The Change, I mean, at least in part, to a poem by a white poet that she found offensive. And I think in some ways the question she maybe was asking herself, and I say this, somewhat speculatively, but based on having heard some of the early iterations of the project in talks that she gave, I think the question she was asking herself was, wait a minute, what about these feelings that I'm having? What is their history? And what is their social context? And what about these feelings as a kind of way of knowing about the world, right? And what would it mean? And so thinking about Rankin's feelings or Serena Williams' feelings in relationship to Audre Lorde and before Audre Lorde, Zora Neale Hurston, then we start to say, well, this is actually a tradition of Black feminist response, right? And then we have something very different going on in terms of intellectual history. That's really kind of what I'm trying to get at.
All right, well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.